Have you ever thought about aging as a spiritual practice? We're about to change your perception of aging and spirituality forever.
Welcome to Aging Unscripted, a podcast about everything related to aging. Here we will explore a wide range of topics aimed at celebrating, supporting, exploring, and honoring the aging journey. I am Robert Smith, and I'm privileged to serve as the Executive Director of Chaplain Services for Christian Living Communities. For this conversation, Jane Vennard is joining to talk about aging as a spiritual practice, really a new way to frame the sacred aging process. Jane is a retired John Wesley Iliff Senior Adjunct Instructor in Spirituality at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. She earned her BA from Wellesley College, her MA from Stanford University, and her MDiv from San Francisco Theological Seminary. She was called to a special ministry of teaching and spiritual direction and ordained in the United Church of Christ. Jane is a spiritual director in private practice and a longtime member of Spiritual Directors International. Jane has taught in a variety of ecumenical settings, led international retreats, published several articles, and 8 books. The latest, Fully Awake and Truly Alive, Spiritual Practices to Nurture Your Soul, is the basis for today's conversation. She also resides at Claremont Park, our original community, with her husband Jim Laurie, a retired Presbyterian minister. Jane, you have a wealth of experience in spiritual practice. Thank you for joining us today. Would you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you?
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is always fun to talk about. I love to talk about spiritual practices. I think it's important to know that my background is in teaching, and I went to seminary in my early 40s, so I was one of the older students at that time, although more and more seminary students are older. And what I found in seminary was not only a lot of my faith questions answered and explored, but also the sense that I knew that I didn't want to be a parish minister. That was very important not to do. That was not my style. Therefore, I was able to be ordained to a ministry of teaching and spiritual direction. And it was at that point when I graduated that I came to Denver and started teaching at the Iliff School of Theology. A wonderful opportunity. What I found, and I had been teaching children and adults in those years before, is that seminary students really longed for experiential learning. And so a lot of my teaching had to do with reflection and prayer time and conversation and discussion and role play, which was wonderful. I often say that I learned most about teaching from teaching 10-year-olds. Because you can't lecture 10-year-olds. You gotta keep them involved. So I enjoyed my teaching there, and it was in the teaching that I really learned more and more and more depth about prayer and spirituality. There's that old saying, if you want to learn something, you better teach it. And so that's what I was doing. The first class I taught there was on prayer, and I soon learned and recognized that prayer in many people's minds was very small, like prayer was like this, and I was beginning to explore the fact that prayer could be much bigger. And it was at that point I realized that the overarching faith practice was spiritual practice, and prayer was one of those, but there was also dancing and drumming and reading and all of those other kinds of things. So I've made a distinction, not a distinction, but a different form for spirituality and prayer. And that's where the question comes in about, well, what's spiritual and what's religious? I was at a seminary, which is a religious seminary, Methodist, but what I found was there was a lot of interest in other forms of spiritual practice. So I really think in terms of my work as spiritual practice, teaching spiritual practice, writing about spiritual practice, and prayer is one of those.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's something you said really resonated with me when I'm ordained clergy as well. And when I felt my call to ministry, the thing that I felt I was called to was helping people wrestle with those hard questions, right? The so what's, what does this mean? Not what's the definition of a theological concept, but how does this apply to my life? What does this mean? How do I answer life's big questions based on my beliefs? And like you, I have found that parish ministry was not my calling, but I thought it was. It turns out it was not. But I have enjoyed getting to walk with people at healthcare settings and now in senior living, walking that journey of life and saying, these are my beliefs. What does this mean? And the definition I've often used for religion and spirituality is spirituality. It's that thing that connects us to the divine, to each other, that gives our life meaning and purpose. And we're all striving to find those connections in life, whether that's to the divine or to each other. And I've been impressed over and over again in my own experience, and there's research that supports this, that those who are engaged in spiritual practices, religious organizations, religious practices, that it really does make an impact on our mind, our body, our spirit, that it improves our health holistically and how we age. And something that you mentioned as we were preparing for this really stood out to me, and I would love to explore that some more, that aging can be a spiritual practice. Can you tell us a bit more about what you mean by aging as a spiritual practice?
Yes, it's been something that I think is important, because often when we talk about aging and spirituality, people talk about, well, what practices should elder people practice? What are they? And I realized this one time when I was invited to give a talk at a secular organization, and they said I could really talk about anything I wanted, and it was an older group of people. And so I thought about, well, I'll talk about spiritual practices for the second half of life. And that seemed good, because everybody there, independent of their religious affiliations, could relate to spiritual practices. And it was then, as I went through the practices I'd been teaching and writing about, it's like, well, this is what goes on in our elder years. I mean, we have to do these things. So like the practice of letting go, which I have always explored with students of any age, but in our elder years, that's a major practice. And if we can see it as a spiritual practice rather than this horrible chore of letting go of things, downsizing, all of that letting go, we have the opportunity to reframe it and to think in terms, as I go about that downsizing and letting go of things, this is a spiritual practice. This is what I need to be doing at this time, and it helps me, as you said, connect. It helps me connect to myself, to my past, and to the sacred in my life.
Yeah. I know you've moved into Claremont Park, one of our communities, and that usually means downsizing, as you mentioned. I'm curious, you talked a little about that process. Anything that stood out in particular to you as you were downsizing and moving in that felt like a growth moment?
Oh, yes. Well, my husband and I really did go at it as a spiritual practice of moving from a large home where we raised the children. Some of it was honoring the past while we did it. It was that sense which is, this was wonderful. That was then and this is now. Do I need this? No. And it in some ways was able to help us recognize the goodness and also let it go. Because I think often its approach is letting go is flinging things aside and denying the past. But no, it's a time to savor the past and let it go. So we were ready to move into this new chapter, and most likely the last chapter of our lives.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's, as you say that, and we're talking about aging, speaking of older adults and those spiritual practices, but I think that's one that's good for anyone. I know my wife and I, as we go through our house, we've lived there for 12 years, and we've all got that drawer, right? That's where the things go, the old cords, the old whatever it might be, and you pull them out and you go, I don't even know what this is, but I might need it. And there's some memory attached, and I have seen that over and over again, just that almost grief, right? It's a process of letting go and moving forward. And when it's done with intention, I think there's tremendous power, because it's all something we have to do at any age in our life, is let go of what has been, honor it, but then move forward. And we hope those things come naturally as we age, but not always.
Right.
So you mentioned the letting go. Are there some other key practices that you see aligned with the aging process that are spiritual practices?
Yes, for sure. And one of them is slowing down and resting. That's one that as younger people, and sometimes we carry into our older age, which is, I just got to get this done and I need to move on, and there's so much opportunity. But out of necessity, we slow down. It takes me longer to get ready in the morning. It takes me longer to walk to the dining room than it used to. And so to see that as a blessing rather than a problem is a lot of it. And in my spiritual direction practice, I find people talking about that a lot. A couple of things. One is the complaint that it takes me so long to do X, Y, Z. Whatever you're doing, it's going to take longer. And the other is I'm sleeping too much. I'm wasting time. I have to rest in the afternoon. And to reframe that as the call to rest, the call to slow down, that's certainly what the mystics taught, and our willingness to engage in that. And I often find people who begin to practice that say it really changes things for them. It's like, I don't need to get there. I've got plenty of time. And so the willingness to embrace that is part of what I think is the heart of spiritual practice and spiritual living in our elder years.
Yeah. I've worked with people who are moving to higher levels of care, be that assisted living or skilled nursing or having some form of home support coming in to help them with some of those tasks. And it can be a hard transition. And one thing that's been impressed on me is this idea of energy, that we all have so much energy we can give to the day. And when you're forced to slow down and you realize you can do less, it's what's important to me today? What are those things that matter, that give me that sense of meaning and purpose so that I can put my energy there and rely on others to help me for those things that maybe don't have that meaning to me. And there's that letting go, right? Those things that used to be part of my life that I have to let go of this to focus on what matters.
And I have a name for that. I call it the stewardship of energy. We talk a lot in religious circles about stewardship of money, and now we talk about stewardship of the land. But I think for older people to recognize that this is an important discernment practice for us of the stewardship of the energy we have. And that, I think, is related to accepting the fact that we're old.
Yeah.
That's another practice, is accepting the present moment, accepting who we are at this time of our lives.
Yeah. We saw during the COVID pandemic this, the Surgeon General called it an epidemic of loneliness come up, and how so many people struggle with isolation and loneliness. And I know one of those practices you've talked about is embracing silence and solitude. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I like the word embracing because it's more than just simply accepting. So I embrace it. And the opportunity in our older years to have some time to be silent. And often that's a problem, and depends on the personality. But some people need more silence, I think, than they recognize. And in the recognition of the silence and embracing that, it deepens our lives. And the thing about loneliness and solitude is that Henry Nouwen, the Catholic mystic, spoke often about changing loneliness into solitude. He saw those things as two different ways of being in the world, and that we're lonely, we feel disconnected. In solitude, we find a deeper connection, both to ourselves and to the divine and to each other.
Yeah. Being alone doesn't mean you're lonely, and being around others doesn't mean that you're not lonely.
Right, exactly. And to recognize the difference and see what energy we have for which aspect of our lives.
Yeah.
Some people need more social time and other people need more solitude.
Right.
And to figure that out and know that the way we age is different for everybody.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about spiritual practices, but I'm curious, when we talk about spiritual struggles sometimes, and in your experience, what are some of those common spiritual struggles that you see people, both in general, but also as we age?
I think the main one that I see from any age is we struggle with our image of God. And that I notice this a lot in seminary students who come into seminary with an image of God that begins to fade, deconstruct. Who is this God that I came to study about? And I think that happens pretty naturally as we age. And it is a letting go process, to let go of the image I grew up with to find a different way of defining what I think of as the mystery, the divine mystery. And language gets confused in there too. But for me, it is that struggle of, if I want to be in connection, if I want to be in relationship with the divine, who is that? What does that look like? It has that sense of, I need to know. And how we image God makes a great deal of difference in how we view ourselves and our lives.
Yeah.
And so that's an ongoing struggle from, well, I think probably from children. I remember asking my mother certain questions when I was 10 years old, which luckily she didn't try and answer. She just told me to figure it out for myself, which was helpful. But I see that as an ongoing struggle at different phases of our lives. Certainly in tragedy, who is this God that I'm in relationship with? Why did this happen?
Yeah, we think of aging as our final years, but really aging is a lifelong process. Hopefully we're all learning and growing. And as we is running a little low on time, I'm fascinated by this idea of aging as a spiritual practice. And it really takes away some of that negativity and harm I think that society can often associate with aging, where we're fighting at CLC, we're trying to fight that ageism and ableism with others, but also within ourselves, and that can be hard. So I'm curious if you have any recommendations for others who might want to begin to adopt this practice of aging as a spiritual practice.
I would say at the heart of it is gratitude. So as I let go of things, I can be grateful for what I have. As I see things differently, and I have people say, why didn't I see this when I was younger? Well, you didn't. Can you be grateful that you see it now? So I would say the practice of gratitude is at the heart of making or experiencing our aging as spiritual practice.
Yeah. Jane, one of the things we talk about often at CLC is fighting against ageism and ableism, those beliefs that as we get older, people believe either they can't do things, that they don't have the ability, or unfortunately, some people look at older adults and say, oh, well, they're old, they can't do certain things, what can they contribute? I know one of your spiritual practices you talk about in the aging process is service to others. And I'd love to hear just a little bit of your perspective on service and that ability for us to continue contributing and giving and creating community as we age.
It's certainly an issue for all of us, I think. When we can't do the things that we did to serve before, I teach no longer, and I've had to give that up. And so the question is, how do I find meaning in what I'm doing? And I think part of it is to remember that small things make a difference. And I was talking to a new resident actually last week, and she said, I've been trying to figure out what I should be doing here. You know, what is going to be my purpose here? And she said, the other day I was talking to somebody in the halls, and she started telling me these stories, and I realized I can listen. That's something I can do, and we all need to be listened to. And so I think it is changing our understanding of what service is about and how we go about our lives, letting go, again, of the things we can't do anymore and finding those things that are small and really do make a difference in people's lives. And one of the things that somebody told me once, which I just love, is that one of the things we can do for service as we age is to ask for help. And that's kind of like a paradox, or that doesn't sound right, to ask for help. And the person said, by asking for help, you're giving an opportunity for another to serve you. And so asking for help can be seen as a spiritual practice of service.
Yeah, it's service and letting go. And, you know, it's funny to hear you say, I know you've given up the professional teaching in the seminary, and yet you're still teaching. I know I'm learning a lot today. I hope others are as well. And I know our chaplain team has been impacted by your wisdom and your teaching. And so it's still moving things forward for generations to come. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. And it just doesn't look the way it did.
Yeah.
But there are many ways to teach.
We got about a minute or two left. Just curious if there's any other thoughts that you wanted to share as we wrap up our time together, anything you might have missed?
Well, I'd like to tell a story, and this is about the practice of accepting ourselves and our age. A couple of years ago, basically, I was in a situation where a little girl and her mother and two younger siblings were there, and I was going through the space, and I heard the little girl, 7 years old, and she whispered to her mother, "She's old." And the mother was so embarrassed and said, I don't remember what she said, but I think of her as my angel because she said the truth. At 82, I'm old. At 84, I'm old. I'm not just getting old. And that acceptance, although people don't like me to say that, they'll tell me I'm not old.
Right. Well, Jane, thank you. Thank you for that, for the wisdom you've shared today, for your time. I know you've impacted so many people. One of our chaplains there at Claremont Park, who introduced us, told me, she said, I had one of Jane's books on my shelf. She said, I had it on there since I graduated college, and it's been so meaningful to me. And I knew Jane for a year before I put together. That was the Jane I knew here and that I had known through her writing. So thank you. This conversation for me has been enlightening, and truthfully, I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. I would love to learn more. For those who are tuning in, Jane has provided several resources, including links to her most recent book, and those will be found in the podcast notes for today's episode. And we appreciate you for joining us today for Aging Unscripted, a reminder that aging is indeed unscripted. There are no rules, and each of us has a journey that's as individual as we are. Aging is a gift not bestowed to everyone. It's a sacred phase of life that should be honored and celebrated. Thank you.